Okay. Is it starting to record?
Yes.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. This is part 2 of our conversation with Dimitri Lascaris on Canada's Canada's right wing, but we're very pressed for time, so we're going to get straight into it. Dimitri, so last time you were on before our conversation abruptly had to end, you were talking about rebel media and how rebel media, for a supposedly independent media project, it engages in a lot of litigation. It sues a lot of people when they claim they've been defamed and so forth. And you were saying that you've known other people who have been the targets of theirs, and everyone sort of scratches their heads. Where does rebel media get all of this money if they're just a YouTube channel with a couple of Patreons? And I was saying to you that I think rebel media, where they probably get all of this money is probably because they do appeal to a large amount of people who don't like who they probably appeal to a Canadian public and others who will never openly say explicitly their racist points of views on Indigenous people, queer people, Muslims, and so forth. And then to have a channel like Rebel Media, which is so outwardly right wing and far right. I mean, it's safe to say that they are very far right. And I would imagine just like the people who flocked to Donald Trump, who, lots of right wingers who said that they liked Donald Trump because he was so anti-PC and anti-political correctness, and that he said things that we all wish we could say out loud. And I imagine that's probably the thing with rebel media. But what's frightening then is the fact that so many people want to put money into that, and the fact that that Ezra and his team are advocates of an oligarchy, are big supporters of Israel, of the ultra Zionist state of Israel. I would imagine that there's probably lots of people, affluent or otherwise, who probably do want to give money to an outlet like that. What do you think?
Well, I just happened to come across a statistic between this discussion and our last discussion about Rebel News, and discovered, I was frankly a bit alarmed about this, but they have 1.45 million subscribers on YouTube. And if you go to their website, they have a subscribe option. So they're apparently, I guess this may be at least a partial answer to my question about their funding. Apparently there's a significant body of people out there who are willing to pay for a subscription to Rebel News. And that, that may be where this money's coming from. But I strongly suspect that there are some, again, I don't know this for a fact, Youri. It's just it's an educated guess on my part, that there are some well-heeled people who are, very right-wing in orientation, who make substantial contributions to this organization.
Yeah, and what else do you want an audience to know about rebel media? Because in a way it's sort of depressing when you think, because if they are a supposedly independent an independent outlet, it's a bit depressing that sometimes I look at your videos of Team Dimitri. Sometimes I'll look at Eve, a mutual friend of ours, Paul S. Graham's YouTube channel, which has great left-wing content, speeches of left voices, anti-imperialist voices. And then you have outlets like the Global Research News Hour. I go on their SoundCloud, or Canadian Dimension, or the Canada Files, and sometimes you look at who's tuning into their live streams or who's listening on their content, and if it gets to 200 something people, that's a really good day for them. But then you look at Rebel Media, and it has the amount of views TYT or the Jimmy Dore Show or some of those left YouTubers, mostly in the U.S. has, and that's a pretty sad state of affairs in Canada, right?
Yeah, but we shouldn't look at the existence of an organization like Rebel News. The fact that it has 1.45 million subscribers ought to concern anyone who cares about human rights, equality, and democracy.
Yeah.
But I don't. At the same time, if you look at polling data in this country, if you look at how Canadians feel about things like a wealth tax, how they feel about their public health care system, their national health care system, how they feel about increasing the top marginal tax rate, and so on. A number of, right across a range of, issues related to economic justice, social justice. The population is overwhelmingly progressive in orientation. That's always been the case, and it continues to be the case today. That's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about the far right. We definitely should. The far right is becoming increasingly vocal. And as the socioeconomic circumstances in our country and throughout the West continue to deteriorate because of neoliberal policies, there's going to be a larger and larger audience for organizations like Rebel News. This is where people sometimes turn, regrettably, out of their anger and their frustration with establishment politics. But we're not at a stage yet where, a far-right party could enjoy broad-based support in this country. And as long as we work diligently to address the increasing levels of socioeconomic injustice in this country, then we will prevail in the end. But that's a big if, because on the current trajectory that we have, the policies that we're currently pursuing, there has been some improvement during the pandemic, and I think that was more out of political desperation. The government had to act, or there would have been, rioting in the streets if they had just allowed millions of people to go unemployed without, suddenly unemployed without providing them with support. So we'll see whether this is a long-term process or not. But certainly before the pandemic began, we were on a trajectory like the United States, not as far advanced, where there was so much injustice, so much anger that somebody like a Donald Trump could actually win the presidency. And if we're not careful, we're going to get there in Canada. So this is for us a wake-up call. What happened in the United States with the Trump presidency, it's a wake-up call.
Before we talk, I want to ask you again about Western alienation and Alberta's right-wing movement. But before we get into that, can you briefly assess the premierships of Doug Ford, Doug Ford of Ontario, Jason Kenney of Alberta, and can you talk to us about the very right-wing celebrity in the form of Jordan Peterson? Can you talk to us about those three individuals? Why and why do you think the electorate voted for Doug Ford in Ontario and Jason Kenney in Alberta?
The reasons, I think, there's some similarities, but the reasons are quite different. In the case of Ontario, what we had was something very similar in our last discussion. We talked about the Harper government and the conditions that led to it coming to power. There was a tremendous amount of revulsion in Ontario for the Liberal government of Kathleen Wynne and her predecessor, McGuinty, the Liberal leader and premier prior to Kathleen Wynne's premiership. There was a tremendous amount of corruption. There was a huge scandal, multi-billion-dollar scandal involving some canceled gas plant contracts. And there was just so much discussed with the Liberal elite and its sense of entitlement that, people just wanted to change. And when they looked across the political spectrum, the party that was most likely the best position to displace the Liberals was the Conservative Party of Doug Ford. And so they voted for him. And let's remember that Doug Ford, because we have this anti-democratic first-past-the-post system, so you can get a majority government with less than 40% of the popular vote, okay, which is, I can't remember the precise percentage, but it was in that range. I believe it was actually significantly less than 40%. So it's not as though there's a majority of people out there supporting him, okay? And that's just the people who vote. Then there are the people, millions of people in Ontario who don't even vote, right? So Doug Ford doesn't represent a majority, but there was enough revulsion with the Liberal government that he skillfully exploited that, and we have the first-past-the-post system. And so that's, I think, largely accounts for why he came to power. And also within the Greater Toronto area, there are the Ford family. Prior, I don't know if you know, but his now deceased brother, Rob Ford, was the mayor of Canada's largest city for a while. And they do have a significant constituency in Toronto, which includes, interestingly, a lot of people from racialized, not a lot, but some people from racialized backgrounds. They have this kind of populist approach which appeals to some persons from marginalized communities, unfortunately. But in the case of Alberta, it's, Alberta's just been moving progressively to the right over the course of the last 30 years, and that province is by far the most right-wing province in Canada. Its dependence upon the fossil fuels industry, its economic dependence makes it implacably hostile to any kind of an agenda that's concerned about the climate crisis. And in fact, something just happened today, Youri, which your audience will probably be very interested in. Jason Kenney and Doug Ford's government and I believe the Saskatchewan government challenged at the Supreme Court of Canada the constitutionality of Justin Trudeau's carbon tax.
Yeah.
Bear in mind that the carbon tax plan that he implemented is very weak and is inadequate, but it was at least it was something. And so they challenged it, and today, literally a few hours ago, the Supreme Court of Canada rendered a decision affirming the constitutionality, something that I certainly expected it to do. And I think that probably the legal advisors of the Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan's governments, I'm not privy to their advice, but I wouldn't be surprised if they told them, this is a long shot for you. It's unlikely that the court, especially in the current circumstances, the desperate circumstances we find ourselves in, is going to get in the way of a carbon pricing plan. But they did it anyways. And Jason Kenney led the charge. And when Biden came to office, it was one of the most shameful moments in Canadian political history. Biden came to office and did one of the few decent things he's done from a climate perspective. He canceled
one of the few decent things he'll ever do.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's hope we're wrong about that. Who knows? Maybe we'll be right. But certainly, based on his record, he's not going to be a champion of in the fight against climate change. But nonetheless, he did cancel the permit for Keystone XL. And what did Jason Kenney do? The most absurd thing, he called for the federal government to impose economic sanctions on the United States. So I can't help laughing because it's so absurd. Canada has a lot more to lose in a trade war with the United States than the United States has to lose in a trade war with Canada. And there was just, and then perhaps the most ludicrous thing, just the sort of desperation of the Kenney government to prop up this, dying and planet-wrecking fossil fuels industry. He set up this war room. He calls it the War Room, which is basically a propaganda organ of the Alberta government designed to, marginalize, demonize those who are calling for meaningful action on climate change. And there was a cartoon recently that I can't think it was on Netflix, a cartoon that Kenney's government felt portrayed the fossil fuels industry in Alberta unkindly. And so he launched a propaganda campaign against Netflix's cartoon. I mean, this is the kind of just, lunacy we see coming out of the Alberta government. But that's not to say, like all provinces, Alberta is not a monolith. There are people in that province, there aren't as many as you might find in other parts of the country, but there's a significant percentage of the Alberta population, I believe it's growing, that's becoming alarmed about the climate crisis. And there's this wonderful movement called I think it's called Iron and Earth. And it is an organization led by former workers in the fossil fuels industry who are advocating for a transition away from fossil fuels. And they're doing really great.
People who would support the LEAP manifesto.
Yes, exactly. And you really want to cut just completely eviscerate the support for the kind of, program that Jason Kenney has always championed, prop up the fossil fuels industry, do whatever the fossil fuels industry wants. The best way to do that is what Iron and Earth is calling for, which is to provide alternatives to workers.
Exactly.
If we do that, and we have the financial capacity to do it, then ultimately, we can get a substantial majority of Albertans, I believe, to support meaningful action on climate change.
And can you talk to us? Let's stay on Alberta while we have you. And I remember I was asking you whether whether there was any legitimacy to this idea of Western alienation, that that Albertans feel that not enough attention is paid to them, that all of the money all the money from fossil fuels is all given to the other provinces and not enough money is given to them. And then, of course, this hatred of liberal bias and a media which is biased towards the Liberal Party. And and of course there's this very crazy movement in Alberta, mostly the Wexit, the people who want to secede from Canada, maybe be its own country or even join the United States. And can you talk to us about how any reflections on that, and why you think that this whole Western alienation thing is over exaggerated, and there's no legitimacy to it.
Yeah, so this Wexit, sort of the Alberta equivalent of Brexit movement, it's thankfully really a marginal movement. I don't think there's a realistic prospect of a large proportion of Albertans ultimately supporting Alberta's secession from the Canadian Federation. And ultimately, I think that that's because at some level they understand that the vast majority of people in Alberta understand that they are better off in Canada, inside Canada, than outside Canada. And the argument that we as Canadians, those of us living outside the province of Alberta, have somehow exploited Alberta or have taken advantage of its generosity, I mean, it just flies in the face of science, frankly, because the only reason why Alberta's fossil fuels industry has been so profitable, especially the tar sands industry, which is now dominates the fossil fuels industry in Alberta. The conventional oil supplies of Alberta have been largely exploited, right? It really, now the fossil fuels industry is primarily concentrated in the tar sands. The only reason why it's been profitable is because they've been externalizing the cost of their production. Okay, like all the environmental destruction, like that's what this carbon tax is about. It's a start. It's not a full internalization of the cost. It's a start in the process of ensuring that the people who are making the money from those industrial operations are bearing all of the burdens arising from the industrial operations. So all of those costs are foisted upon not just all of Canadians. We all have borne the costs environmentally of the Alberta tar sands and the other sectors of the fossil fuels industry, but all of humanity is bearing those costs. So when you look at the science and you look at the impact that climate change is having, and you look at the amount of money we're going to have to spend now to stave off a climate catastrophe, and all Canadians are going to have to pitch in that regard, it's actually absurd for people in Alberta to feel as though they've been taken advantage of. With all due respect to my fellow Canadians in Alberta, I think that that's an absurdity. And ultimately what we should be doing is working together to do two things: to save the planet and to do it in a way that protects workers in Alberta and elsewhere in Canada who are dependent, or who are going to potentially be harmed by the transition to a renewable energy economy. If we can do those things together, and we have the means to do them, then I think that this sense of alienation will quickly disappear and become a historical artifact.
And I want to read very quickly because I remember you asking that question to Eve Engler after the last general election in Canada, and I think what Eve responded really bears repeating. Eve said the following: "No, I don't think that there's that prospect. I think basically that the media feeds this Alberta discontent, Saskatchewan discontent to the point where they've defined the West, cutting out the actual most western province of BC, which is not necessarily on board in this pro-conservative Alberta, Saskatchewan. No, I mean, watching the CBC commentaries last night and bemoaning Alberta, the alienation, I mean, let's get down to it. This is about the fact that there are forces that want to move forward with extracting tar sands in a way that's going to guarantee the collapse of human civilization. And people in Alberta need to be told that very clearly. Those oil reserves, those heavy bitumen, need to be kept in the ground. And that's been the problem. Nobody wanting to call a spade, including Justin Trudeau, who made that declaration to oil reserves in Houston 2 years ago about finding about 170 billion barrels of oil in the ground. And then,
what country would leave any of that oil in the ground? As he said. Sorry,
exactly. And as Eve was saying, he was saying that the stories about negativity, the downturn in Alberta, the wage is still higher, the standards are still higher than the rest of the country, and this is really about, we have to tell them we have to go into a different direction. And if people in Alberta are going to threaten to leave Canada over a destroying human civilization, well, I think the chips need to be put down to the people of Alberta if they want to go in that direction.
Yeah. So I recall that exchange with Eve. I agree with much of what he said, but I get his, as somebody from Montreal, where here in Quebec, where Eve and I live, There's, relative to the rest of Canada, most of the rest of Canada, very high concern about the climate crisis. And Quebec is, much less dependent upon fossil fuels and much less concerned about preserving the fossil fuels industry in this country. So I get where he is coming from, but, we also as Canadians and just as human beings need to be mindful of the fact that people who have, earned their livelihood from the fossil fuels industry, and that's all they know, or even people who just been working in the industry for a few years and it's the best economic opportunity they have, it's entirely understandable that they would be concerned about what's going to happen if you shut the industry down. And it's a legitimate concern, and it's a concern that we have to address, and the government hasn't done that. So one thing that I kept advocating for last year, it's not my idea, this actually came from people in Alberta, and particularly an activist by the name of Reagan Boychuk, he's got an organization, an advocacy group called Reclaim Alberta, and he has been tireless. He's an Albertan through and through, and he's been tireless about pointing out the fact that in Alberta, you have an enormous problem with orphan wells, what they call unremediated wells that are no longer productive, okay, and are on the verge of becoming unproductive. These things are an environmental disaster, an unfolding environmental disaster. And the Alberta Energy Regulator, which has been completely captured by the tar sands industry, is supposed to be collecting security from the fossil fuels industry to ensure that the money is there to remediate these wells when they become unproductive. And an internal report from the AER was leaked to the public a couple of years ago. The AER has collected, I think, something like 1.6 billion in security. And the internal report suggested that the ultimate cost of remediating these wells could be as high as $250 billion. And some people think that even that's conservative. Okay, so that is a job that must be done. And doing the job would create enormous amounts of employment. And so, Reagan and Avi Lewis, a couple of years ago, they did an op-ed together in which they called for a reclamation jobs boom. Reclaiming those lands and restoring the environment to its original state will create a jobs boom in Alberta. That's what people of Alberta need to hear, and they need to know that we got their back. And that was, I think, the thing that, I understand Yves' frustration. A lot of people in Quebec feel it when it comes to Alberta's sense of alienation. But we have to convey to our fellow Canadians in Alberta that we got their back, and we haven't done that. We got to make sure that the oil industry puts up the money to clean up its mess. And neither the federal nor the provincial government of Alberta is doing anything remotely necessary to ensure that they pay for the cleanup.
Time is almost running out. Can you talk briefly about Maxime Bernier and the People's Party, and his YouTube channel is becoming sort of like a second home to rebel media fans. Can you talk to us about Maxime Bernier and his People's Party, and should we see them as just a bit of a distraction from the more effective evil right-wing parties, or should we be concerned about the People's Party, who the only thing I agree with Maxime Bernier is that he wants to abolish the Indian Act, but other than that, climate change and everything else.
You're remarkably well informed about Canadian affairs. My hat's off to you. So
thank you.
I know more about Canadian affairs than most people living in this country do. So really, it's impressive. But Maxime Bernier came out of the Conservative Party, the Harper Conservative Party, and he ran to be the leader of the Conservative Party after Harper withdrew from the leadership, and he almost won. He came very close to winning.
But he didn't. Second place, right?
Yeah, second place. And, he didn't get what he wanted, so he packed up his toys and he left the sandbox. If he had actually, I'm not the only person who thinks this, some political observers in this country think that if he'd actually stuck around, he would now be the leader of the Conservative Party. Because Andrew Scheer, who was frankly a bit of a buffoon, performed so poorly in the last election that there was a massive push within the party to replace him. And he would have, Bernier would have been in an excellent position to assume the leadership. Instead, what he did was he went off and he started this little party you referred to, the People's Party, and they got crushed in the 2019 election. Bernier himself didn't win a seat. They got no seats. And then Bernier, I believe, ran in a by-election subsequent to the 2019 election. It may have been in Toronto Centre, but wherever it was, I don't know if it was Toronto Centre, but he ran in a...
Yeah. It was definitely somewhere in Toronto, yeah.
Not only did he not win, I think he finished in something like third or fourth place. So, he's if Bernier himself can't get a seat after 2 attempts in Parliament, I think the writing is on the wall for the People's Party of Canada. Barring some unforeseen political disaster, I think that party is likely going to disappear. It's not going to be influential. What I'm much more concerned about is the right-wing media, and like Rebel News, like Post Media, and how they are influencing public opinion in nefarious ways, so that we are not taking the steps necessary at the federal and provincial level in order to have a socially just, democratic society, and in order to have a sustainable economy. So that's really the perniciousness of the right in this country. It's not so much that people like Maxime Bernier stand a prospect of gaining power. It's that they're polluting public discourse so much and manipulating public opinion in such a way as to prevent the work that needs to be done for the sake of our democracy and the future of our children.
Well, I don't have enough time to ask you any more questions. We unfortunately have to conclude there. But while I still have 3 more minutes with you, I think the big question that I have to ask you is how can we can't give the answers for everybody in the world, but how can the Canadian left get together to push back against the right when they unfortunately have to fight against a center-right Liberal Party, an NDP which is trying to be diet liberal, and then your own party of the Green Party? You and Miriam Haddad are not the leaders. We have Annamie Paul, who I would also describe as diet liberal or diet NCP. So how can the left get together to push back against the right when I have a funny I have a feeling that Aaron O'Toole might win an election against Justin Trudeau, because it goes back because of that same cycle of people just being fed up with the Liberals and their them being a rival oligarch party and them being part of the problem.
Well, I'll give you the same answer I gave just this past weekend. There was an event organized, an online event organized by Progressive International. For those who are listening to us and they don't know, it's founded, I believe, out of Europe by leading people from the left in Europe, like Jeremy Corbyn, Yanis Varoufakis, and its goal is essentially to unite progressives around the world. And so, in this online event, Nikki Ashton, who's from the New Democratic Party, competes with the Green Party of Canada, the party that I'm a member of, for votes in this country. She had a virtual conversation with Jeremy Corbyn, and Nikki asked me to submit a statement. I know Nikki well. I'm not concerned at all that she's a member of the NDP. What I know about Nikki is that she's a principled and real progressive who will fight hard for working Canadians and the poor and Indigenous people. That's what I know about Nikki, and that's what matters to me. So I videotaped a statement in which I called for one thing, and that was the unity of the left. We have to find, even if we're not able to combine our parties together, and I don't think the political conditions exist in this country, for example, to see the Greens and the NDP merge. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But there are ways in which we can cooperate. There's lots of cooperation short of a merger that we can do. For example, in the next election, we can come to an arrangement about which ridings we're going to contest vigorously in order to maximize the results for both the NDP and the Green Party in Canada's Parliament. And there's a group called One Time Alliance for Democratic Reform, which is advocating for that. And I support that group entirely. So we have to unite, and unity can take a lot of forms. We can be creative in terms of how we unite. And we have to identify who the common enemy is. The common enemy is the oligarchy. The common enemy are the rich who are driving us down the path of extinction. And they are the ones who have a stranglehold on the political process and on the media in this country. That is the way we are going to overcome this. And we just, not only do we need to unite domestically, we need to unite internationally. And that's precisely why I think Progressive International was created, to facilitate the unification of the left across the world. To those of us who are listening or are asking that question, I would urge you to find ways to collaborate with and join forces with other leftists, even if they aren't necessarily part of your faction, your political party, whatever it may be.
Exactly. Alrighty. On that note, Dimitri has to go, so we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri, it was an honor to have you back on. This conversation will be continued because there's more about the right wing I want to talk to you about, but I also want to talk to you about environmental issues as well next time I have you on. But that'll be to be continued. So thank you for joining us, and best of luck to best of luck to everything.
Always a pleasure. Take care.
Likewise.